Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's virtual Talk atTwo, coming to you live from the Dixon Gallery and Gardens and from Oxford, England. Our special guest for this installment is a very special guest indeed. It's my pleasure to introduce the award-winning author of books on Italian, French, Canadian art and history, the one and only Ross King. Now, like many others, like many of you, I suspect, I came to know the work of Ross King about 20 years ago when I read an incredible book called Brunelleschi's Dome, which chronicled the building of the Duomo in Florence. Just a remarkable book. He followed that masterwork up with Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling in 2002, The Judgment of Paris, kind of a personal favorite of mine, in 2006. Then came Leonardo and the Last Supper in 2012, and most recently, he published Mad Enchantment, Claude Monet and the Painting of the Water Lilies in 2016. His appearance today is actually quite timely, since his next book, his newest book, is coming out tomorrow. And that book is called The Bookseller of Florence, the story of the manuscripts that illuminated the Renaissance. So I've already pre-ordered my copy, and I hope all of you will too after our little conversation today. In addition to these wonderful books, Ross King found time to produce an essay for our current exhibition catalog, America's Impressionism, Echoes of a Revolution, which is edited by Amanda Burden from the Brandywine River Museum of Art. His piece is called Claude Monet and In the Land of the Yankees, and it's at least part of what we'll be talking about today. It's a wonderful essay. So as always, please use the chat feature down at the bottom of your screen to send us your questions for Ross, and we'll get to as many of them as time allows. And with that, it's my great honor to give you Ross King.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Margarita.
Ross, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your excellent work on America's Impressionism. We all felt like it was such a coup to have a contribution from you.
Well, it was a really fun exercise for me, and it was also an honor, because one of the things I've always wanted is to appear in a beautiful art history exhibition catalog, because as you can probably see, I've got quite a few behind me, even more inside the house, and so they're always one of my go-to places for research, and yet I had never I'd never appeared in one previously, and so now finally I appear in the beautifully produced Dixon catalog.
Yeah, we're very proud of that. We're very proud of the book. It did turn out
Yeah.
beautifully, and your essay on Monet made such an interesting contribution. Now, I guess my first question is, the circle of painters who came to be known as the French Impressionists brought any number of personal aesthetics to their artistic practices. My question is, who were the first American artists to discover Monet? How did they come to know his work in the first place? And why was he so attractive to them?
Yeah, I mean, very interesting questions. And there's a whole kind of cast of characters involved in this. But the typical way, I'll maybe speak generically initially before I'll give a couple of more concrete examples. But the way that you would discover him, if you were an American, would have been at sometime after the mid 1870s. You as a young painter, male or female, would have gone to Paris, maybe on a kind of scholarship after having studied for a couple of years in America. You would go to Europe and you would study in, if you were maybe, well, you could say perhaps lucky, you'd study somewhere like the École des Beaux-Arts, or you could study at some of the academies run by, as sort of private concerns by some of the painters. So you would study with them and also go and look at exhibitions such as the Impressionist exhibitions, which were being staged in Paris at that time. And what your professor at the École would say is stay away from the Impressionists. Claude Monet is dreadful. He's a terrible painter, no technique. and give you a real ticking off if you praised him or anything like that. And so young American painters, such as J. Alden Weir, sort of had ingrained in them initially a kind of resistance and hostility to French Impressionism and to Monet in particular. Weir called the American or the Impressionist painters a chamber of horrors. He said these were terrible paintings. And of course, he later became a convert. And then how you became a convert, I suppose, if you were one of these painters, is you saw the works for yourself. You didn't just take the word of your stodgy old professor at the école. And you then also met other young enthusiasts, maybe some of them French, other American students, and you would go off to little artistic colonies at places like Pont-Aven in Brittany, where a lot of young American painters went, up on the Normandy coast, places like that, where you would begin to paint landscape and sort of get weaned off the école tradition of the highest kind of painting being history painting, painting heroic people posing heroically in togas and ancient armors, things like that. They sort of fell in love with the French landscape, and then ultimately when they went back to America, with the American landscape, and they in many ways learned to see the landscape, the American landscape, through the eyes of someone like Claude Monet, which is why when Guy Rose and Charles Hassam went to Point Lobos in California near Carmel, where I had a year ago an expedition planned because I was doing something in San Jose, and I'd always wanted to go there to see the beautiful rocks because of those paintings. And of course, it was canceled. So that's one more thing I have to do. The exhibition has one of the beautiful Guy Rose paintings of the California coast in it. But that clearly is influenced. Guy Rose was clearly influenced by Monet's paintings of the Manipur on the Normandy coast and things like that. And so you can see that the way that when they went back to America, light bulb would go off in their head, and they would think, this reminds me of what it looked like in France, or when I was painting there back in the late 1880s. So, I mean, if we want to give credit to the first person to come to Giverny, I think the race was probably won by Willard Metcalf, who I think can be dated there from about 1885, and knew Monet. He was friends with friends of Monet, and clearly sort of sat at the master's side, perhaps, and communed with him, worked with him, and was inspired by him. And very quickly, other painters came, such as Theodore Robinson and Theodore Earl Butler, people like that, who had very close connections with Monet, and even to the point of living next door to him.
Margarita, why don't we share the screen? And because I think some of the artists that Ross mentioned, we have some examples. Willard Metcalf, to me, Ross, Willard Metcalf comes off as really a fascinating figure in the America's Impressionism exhibition. He gets kind of his due in a way in the first section of the exhibition and in the book itself. And I would say, let's go straight to that first Metcalf, Margarita. I think Julie's already plugged the book. Just give us a moment.
Ultimately, there would have been probably, maybe by the 1890s, 1900, there were probably more Americans than French in Giverny. I think they've cataloged hundreds and hundreds of American painters. So if you came in the summer months in the decade of the 1890s, or really the 2 decades before the First World War, you would have heard a lot of English spoken. It became a kind of rite of passage or a rite of passage to go into the countryside outside of Paris, to go to places like Fontainebleau, where the Barbizon painters had all worked, to go to the Normandy coast, to go to Brittany and the Brittany coast and paint there. But because Giverny was so close to Paris, you could get there very quickly and easily. And it was um, uh, believed to have a kind of special light. I think what attracted Monet to it was what attracted the other painters. Ultimately, they came because of him,
Right.
because of their sort of fondness for his style of art. But they stayed not just because of Monet, because as I discuss in my essay, Monet had very little to do with most of them. Certainly people like Metcalfe, Robinson, Butler, Breck, who went out with his one of his stepdaughters, and Butler, who married two of them. The first one, Suzanne, sadly passed away in the late 1890s, and he then married her sister. They had very close relationships with Monet personally. But for the most part, if you were a young, fresh-faced 26-year-old who turned up around 1900, you would see the great man under his white umbrella, maybe in the fields outside of Giverny. But if you approached him, you would probably get nothing more than a growl in return. And it took Guy Rose 2 years of kind of subtly stalking Monet to get any positive attention from him. But Rose actually did become an intimate of Monet, part of his circle. But it really was just a handful, maybe a half dozen American painters had good access to him, to the point where, as we see in this beautiful painting, which is interesting for all sorts of reasons, but it shows, first of all, that Metcalfe got access to Monet's garden. This is 1885, so he has just turned up. And Monet clearly is not the sort of sacred monster he's going to become in later decades, because he lets this young guy, and Metcalfe at this point is no one. He's just this young guy from Boston. I think he got in probably because he knew John Singer Sargent, and Sargent was the other one who came in 1885, and he maybe in some ways managed to get Willard into Monet's garden and to have contact with the great man. This is very interesting because Monet does not own the house and garden at this time. He's just renting, and he's been in the house in Giverny at this point for just 2 years. And therefore, he's not turning it into the kind of beautiful fantasy land, the garden that we know. So what we see, he's ultimately going to buy more land in the early 1890s and turn that into the water garden. But he's experimenting here with his garden, because in his previous two houses, at Argenteuil and then at Vétoil, which are both farther upstream on the Thames, he kept moving farther downstream until he reached Giverny. He was a passionate gardener. And so he's had 2 years, a couple of summers by this point, to put his gardening skills into practice. And I'm not aware of Monet having painted his garden this early, as the mid 1880s. So Metcalfe might have the distinction of being the first person to paint Monet's garden. And so I think this is an absolutely wonderful coup for the exhibition to get this painting and to have it as part of the show. Quite apart from it being very beautiful as a painting, historically it's important because of what it tells us about the Giverny group, and it's also you could say from a horticultural or botanical point of view, it's interesting because it gives us Monet's garden in its embryonic state. So it's a wonderful, just for all sorts of reasons, it's a wonderful representation.
Plus, it's in a private collection and not always available or seen. So, the other thing I would say is a kind of interesting thing about Monet, and we know this from his paintings, is that he had no hesitation to seriously garden properties that he rented. So that's the case with Argenteuil and with Butler before Giverny. And so that's, Metcalfe in a way almost seems a bit like a trespasser on, trying, just in his effort to try to soak up, Monet's aesthetic. But then on the other hand, there's Theodore Robinson, who, and why don't we advance the slide, Margarita, to the Robinson. Well, there's this other incredibly beautiful Metcalfe.
Yeah.
My goodness. It's one of my favorite paintings in the show. But moving on to the Robinson.
Kind of Monet. Sorry, he's got a kind of that deep Monet green in that painting.
Mm-hmm.
In Giverny, they referred to that color, which Monet, painted the shutters of his house and had it in various parts of the house, and it was known locally as Monet green. And Metcalfe has, a couple of years later now, on this, what looks to be this, I'm not sure which river this is, obviously a tributary of the Seine. It might be the Rue, which is the one that actually flowed into Monet's garden, right. And the one that provided the water for the Water Lily pond. So again, very interesting, not just the beautiful light that he's capturing here, that you can see in those trees on the left in particular. I mean, this evokes a point in time. This is kind of late afternoon, early evening sunshine in very high summer. And yeah, it's done very beautifully.
I completely agree. And, you could almost make the case that Metcalfe, because he does have some academic training, is maybe a better figure painter than Monet. Maybe.
Yes. The interesting thing about some of these painters is that when they come to Giverny, they change their style. A lot of them begin in a kind of tonalist or Barbizon style, because that's what they've grown up on. That's what they've seen in the United States. And that's what, somewhere like the Old Lyme Colony in Connecticut, that was the kind of painting that was done there. And that, maybe in the 1860s, 70s, early 80s, was the sort of radical, maybe somewhat controversial style of French painting. So that's what they knew. And then suddenly they arrived in Paris and realized, there's a new generation here in France, and we love what they're doing, and we're going to practice that and turn our hand to it, as Metcalfe does here so beautifully.
Yeah. Well, let's turn our attention to Theodore Robinson now, and whereas if Metcalfe was, maybe getting a little too close for Monet's comfort, Robinson always kind of keeps himself at a respectful distance, but ultimately gains greater access and becomes kind of a crucial figure in the dissemination of Monet's legend in the United States.
Yes, and I think part of that just comes through the quality of Robinson's work. I'm sure, I don't know a lot about Robinson's personality, but Monet was a very difficult character. Very much a type A personality, not very articulate, not talkative, and in some ways didn't like talking about art. And this is one of the things that made him a very reluctant teacher. But somehow Robinson clearly won him over at a very early point in his time in Giverny, and spent a good deal of time there, and was very well connected with him. And many people probably know that the beautiful painting he did of Theodore Earl Butler marrying the wedding march, where Butler marries one of Monet's stepdaughters, Suzanne. And so he was sort of the wedding photographer, the official portrait of the Monet wedding, which was, I'm sure, the event of the season in Giverny in, I believe it was 1892. And so he had very close access, and he's one of these painters then who goes back to America, and sadly died, I think, quite prematurely.
Right.
but did very beautiful work in America after having, and those wonderful paintings he did in the sort of, which are such landmarks of American Impressionism, he clearly could not have done without having come to Giverny and met Monet, and also been exposed to the other things that he saw in France as well. This is something he couldn't, in a kind of native way, picked up in America. He had to come to France and experience it and see views like this. He's clambered up the hillside. This is the right bank of the Seine, and he's looking down. That's Vernon in the distance, the sort of biggest nearby local town that he's done the image of. And so if we pan to the left after a second or two, we would see Giverny. So he's really above the village, looking down at the river. And what attracted them was this sort of microclimate, as I was saying, that it was believed that Giverny had. And I've been there on very rainy days in May, and it does seem that there, with the moisture from the Seine, combined with this escarpment, which we see beginning to rise up in the right of the picture, seems to trap the moisture. I mean, and you get these beautiful Monet effects of, you get what he called the envelope. Monet said that he wasn't painting the object, he was painting what was between himself and the object. And he said, all in all, that's a violet in color. And so we can see that this is the sort of, those are the hues and the concern with light that these young painters, when they come to Giverny, the scales fall from their eyes, and they realize that they're going to make an attempt to do that also.
And Margarita, why don't we go to the next slide? Because as Ross has alluded to a couple of times now, in terms of access to Monet, no one topped Theodore Butler. And this is, of course, the Theodore Butler painting a very Monet subject in about 1897, and this is, of course, a painting in the Dixon's permanent collection.
Yes, and what a painting it is! I mean, look at the grain stack, which has all of those streaks of color in it, and he's got the I would assume a setting sun probably striking it on the right-hand side of it and lighting it up. And this is very much a Monet theme, because of course Monet made his name with his grain stack paintings less than a decade earlier. So going and planting himself in this field outside of Giverny, really very close to Monet's house, he would have someone like Willard Metcalf painting Monet's garden. When Metcalf does that, he's really nailing his colors to the mast, and he's sort of throwing in his lot with the Impressionists, because he is saying, not so subtly, I'm an intimate of Claude Monet, and I'm doing a Monet-style painting literally in his garden. And Butler's doing much the same thing here, because in 1897, or at any point in the 1890s, no one in Paris, or really America by that time, could look at a grain stack painting or look at a work of art like this and not think of Claude Monet. The danger to that, obviously, is that you may suffer in comparison, because, in comparison to the master. But I don't think there's a danger here for Butler, because he has great interest in the foreground, the way he has sort of ignited whatever the harvested crop and the earth that we see in the immediate foreground, in the left foreground. He has all sorts of interest and attention there, and he's using perspective with that fence in the way that Monet doesn't give us. So, and he gives us a background scene as well. So in many ways, it's a Monet painting, and he's not in competition with Monet. He's not trying to out Monet him, but it's a kind of homage to Monet, in which he shows what Theodore Butler, is capable of. And as you said, Kevin, he had very close relations with Monet personally, and was able to marry not just one, but two of his stepdaughters. Very fortunately for him, initially Monet was not happy, not so much with Butler, but the idea of his daughter marrying a painter, because Monet, of all people, was sort of offended that, a painter, I think he wanted something better for the girls. And so I'm not sure who he would have had them marry, but ultimately he did become a bit of a snob. And so he thought that his stepdaughters maybe should be given away to someone else. And he actually came back. I'm sure many, if not all of you, know Monet's beautiful Rouen Cathedral paintings. He was in Rouen painting them in 1891, in the winter of 1891, and he got a letter from his wife, or his soon-to-be wife. They weren't married at that point. And she said that, oh, by the way, Mr. Breck, this young American painter, is asking for the hand of my daughter Blanche, or he's stepping out with Blanche. And Monet beat a hasty retreat out of Rouen and came rushing home to put the kibosh on that relationship. And poor Breck then left Giverny. And if I remember right, he died accidentally about 10 years later.
You're right.
Sort of gas poisoning. And I always think that possibly he, had he stayed in Giverny, he would have lived another 30 years or something like that. We would have many more of his paintings, because he also did very beautiful grain stack paintings.
Yeah.
Yes, very interesting interrelationships, relationships developing, relationships being frustrated, and relationships ultimately working out between Monet and all of these American visitors to Giverny.
Yeah. I've always felt that Butler was most certainly playing with fire when he painted this particular subject, but he really does pull it off. I mean, it's chromatically different enough from what Monet was trying to do in recording the light that it somehow comes off as being a very effective and very beautiful Theodore Butler. I also think that it may, even when Monet was very, very poor, he was already a snob. He was kind of a snob about, he was probably, I think your point about him hoping his stepdaughters married someone other than painters is probably true, but I would also guess the fact that they're American. He had a great deal of anxiety about so much of his work turning up in American collections, but it becomes the source of his fairly phenomenal wealth.
Yes.
How does that happen?
Well, it happens thanks to the hard work of Paul Durand-Ruel, his long-suffering art dealer, who in 1883 did send 3 of his paintings with some other of the Impressionist works to an exhibition of really a kind of commercial exhibition. I'm trying to think what the equivalent today would be, a kind of trade fair, where the French exported or had on display all sorts of their products, wines, cigarette holders. There was even, I think, a revolving cannon that a French inventor had been working on. And they also sent paintings, and 3 of them were Monet's paintings. And none of them sold. And in fact, the reviews in Boston were not particularly good. But then a number of years later, 5 or 3 years later, in 1886, Monet came back very sort of in triumph. He came back with 40 paintings at the National Academy of Design in a sort of Durand-Ruel curated show. And 37 of the 40 sold, and they sold to very prominent collectors, people like Abel Kingman, who was basically many of them sold to tycoons. And this is the point where the Monet gold rush begins in the late 1880s, and it continues really for the rest of his life with Kevin, when you said that Monet was worried about his works going to America, that's where the title of my essay in the catalog comes from. Monet complained to Durand-Ruel about sending his paintings "Oh, pay the Yankees," that he didn't want. And there was, in some ways, you could have said a realistic fear in some ways that so many of Monet's paintings were going to go to America. And Monet was worried. He wanted them to stay in France. He said, in some ways, he conforms to the stereotype that some people might have of a Gallic snob who looks down on American culture. And what he said is that, that too many of his paintings were going to America, and only in Paris was there taste. Here, there's still a little bit of taste, he said, about 1900. But in fact, the taste for Monet was, at that time, was all in America. And so what we have from beginning the late 1880s through the 1890s, through the great Gilded Age years, and then for the rest of his life, are American collectors, some of the most wealthy and discriminating people in America, buying his works. And however Monet may have grumbled about his works going to America, and in fact, he was always going to be able to be prolific enough to requite appetite everywhere for his work. However much he might have grumbled, he was always going to accept the checks that came to him in Yankee dollars. So he never failed to cash the checks. And so this money allowed him to live in the lifestyle to which, let's face it, all of us would love to be accustomed, because it was at this point then in 1890, after he begins getting this money, that he is able to buy the place that he has been renting in Giverny. And having bought it, he can begin making it over in his own image, and he can turn it from this sort of cider farm, which is what has traditionally been, into his painting paradise. And because he builds himself ultimately 2 studios. And then, of course, by the early 1890s, he purchases extra land on the other side of the road and railway and begins developing his water garden, which he will spend the rest of his life developing. And really from 1903 on, spend the rest of his life painting. And so...
Well, excuse me, but Margarita, this might be a great time to transition to Mad Enchantment, Ross's book about Monet and his phenomenal water gardens at Giverny. Ross, can you speak a little bit about the evolution of? I think you were just getting ready to touch on the evolution of those gardens at Giverny.
Yes, so he bought his house in 1890, and then a couple of years later bought the land through which the river Rue, this tributary of the Seine, which then went down and emptied itself into the Seine. He bought this plot of land and began diverting through sluice gates into his property, because I'm sure many of you have been to Giverny. Those are not naturally occurring ponds. That's the kind of water meadow behind his house. And what he has done is created through a series of excavations, and then by diverting the water from the river, created these ponds, artificially. And then, of course, constructed his Japanese bridge over it and things like that. But it's interesting when he's doing this in the 1890s, and it takes him the better part of 12 years for it to reach what is becoming its final state. And he spent a fortune on it. He spent a fortune doing it, and he then spent a fortune keeping it up, because he had 6 gardeners, and a couple of them, their daily task was to go out in a little boat, like what we saw in that Willard Metcalf painting, and dunk the water lilies, because they're beside a road, which until 1907 was just a dirt or gravel road, grid road of some sort. And so when a car came by in 1906, it would leave a cloud of dust that would settle on the water lilies. And so Monet would send his gardeners out to wash off the water lilies, to dunk them in the water each morning so that they were in a pristine state. But by 1907, he paid for the paving of the road outside of his house. But he also then put a hole in the wall so people could peer through into his garden, which is a rare kind of act of charity on the part of Monet, a sort of rare concession to giving public access to his gardens. So yes, he by 19 well, by about 1899 he begins painting the Water Lily Pond, and didn't really do a lot with the paintings, but clearly he was doing this with a plan. His plan was going to be that he started doing his water lilies. And because when he first saw the water lilies, the colored water lilies, because they're a hybrid form from a Mesoamerican variety of water lily crossed with a hardy Normandy species, so that it could survive in the climate of Normandy, survive in Northern Europe. And when Monet first saw them in about 1890, he said, this could be a good motif for painting. And that phrase sort of resounds down the decades and ultimately across the centuries, because of course, what he always planned to do, I think, from the moment he saw those, was to make a water lily pond and make that his motif. Because of course, what he began doing in the 1880s was doing his, what are called his series paintings, where he'll take a particular motif, like the River Seine early in the morning, like Rouen Cathedral's facade, like the grain stacks, or like the Creuse Valley, the River Creuse in central France. And day after day, he'll sit there and cover canvas after canvas with the motif in different weathers, different times of the day, different seasons, different light conditions. And that's really what he made his reputation doing, and enjoyed spectacular success with it. And so what he decided to do, I think, from the moment he saw those water lilies in the Trocadero in Paris in 1890, was to do this with water plants. And that, of course, then became possible by the early part of the 1900s. And as I say, in the 20th century, Monet rarely budged from the side of his pond. And certainly he went to Venice in 1908 and painted water there. And in some ways, what he was doing at that point was learning how to paint water. He knew that all of the great artists, such as Turner, painters that he admired, had worked in Venice. And so he wanted to go to Venice, I think, and learn how to paint that kind of water, that very reflective water. And so that was a kind of tune-up for what he was doing in Giverny, really for the rest of his life. Because what I do in Mad Enchantment is look at the last 12 years of his life, from 1914 to 26, where he does virtually nothing but sit by the side of the pond through the 4 years of the First World War, and then through his decline, a slow decline, but it was a decline, through the 1920s, through his difficulty with his eyesight and so forth. And look at his obsession with that, with painting the water lilies, with this one motif, which he now is painting in a way that a way in which he's never worked before, working on a larger scale and working away from the motif, because those paintings are so large, many of them, that he simply could not have had these gigantic canvases by the side of the water lily pond. So he painted them back in his studio, in his gigantic studio, what's now the gigantic gift shop at the Monet Foundation in Giverny. So they're sort of dreamscapes that he's painting. He's been doing nothing but painting this motif for almost decades at this point. And so by the time he's applying his paint to his canvas in his shed, in his gigantic aircraft hangar studio, he can almost dream his way into these paintings. He doesn't need to see the waters now. And so that's what makes them so abstract and really expressionistic as well as impressionistic.
I love this photograph of this one. It's, a very early example of color photography, which we got a glimpse of in a show we did a few years ago about color photography. But it's Monet in his dapper English suits and his hat and this beautiful, beautiful garden. It's just kind of incredible to see him this way.
Yes, I mean, I love this photograph because it would be very difficult today to get a better photograph of We've got beautiful depth of field in it, and it really places us there. I know almost nothing about early photography, but I gather this is something called autochrome lumiere, and I gather that the color filter was potato starch. So
You're right.
Very primitive, but it's turned out so beautifully. And so we have the privilege of seeing Monet in color, in the glory of his garden. Here he is with his geraniums and beside his house, which is absolutely covered in greenery. And so it really transports us back. I believe this is 1918. It was taken the summer just as the war was ending, although at that point it was still very unclear that the war was going to end. But Monet, at this point, the clue that he's beginning to have eyesight trouble is the hat that he's wearing, because staring, if you have cataracts, I think sitting beside the water, staring at a reflective surface of water and the sun coming off the water is not good for your eyes. And by 1918, the cataracts, which were diagnosed in 1912, and which he made a great fuss about in 1912, didn't seem to bother him for the next 6 years. But suddenly in 1918, his eyes do begin to give him troubles again. And so he begins, I think, very prudently wearing a hat outside to protect his eyes from the sun.
Plus, he looks good in it.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so he's got these incredible geraniums, and those are climbing nasturtiums on the little trellises, the little charming, handmade trellises. And then he's circling it with a ring of dianthus. And I know this because I dragged our director of horticulture over here and made him identify all of the plants in this photograph. I also know this is not easy gardening to do. This is pretty labor intensive, actually. I mean, because we're looking at annuals, we're looking at immaculately kept paths. I mean, it's just I love this photograph for lots and lots of reasons, and not all of them are about necessarily directly about Monet.
Yes, but I mean, Monet would be glad you have that sort of interest in it, because one of the things he said at the end of his life in the autumn of 1926, as he probably finally realized that the end was coming, he said, what will survive of me is my garden, not my paintings. And in some ways, painting gave him pleasure, but it frustrated him. And as I tell in the book, he slashed up canvases, he burned them, he put his feet through them, he flew into dreadful rages sometimes as he painted, which is very counterintuitive when we look at his paintings, because I think we get this feeling of tranquility, but this tranquility cost Monet's mental health very dearly. However, gardening the blossoms brought him only pleasure. Apart from the times when windstorms came and his garden did get struck several times. The Water Lily pond was flooded, because that is, after all, in a floodplain, and the Seine does flood. And so he got swamped a few times in high winds, and he would fly into a rage about that. But otherwise, I mean, he's very happy, and we can understand why in this photograph, because he's in this beautiful landscape that he has created for himself.
Margarita, let's make a brief stop. I think the next one is Monet sitting in his car.
Yes, I love that photograph, because it tells us a few things about him. One of which, again, to speak of things that are counterintuitive, Monet was a car guy. He was a car nut who loved fast cars. He himself didn't learn to drive, but he had a chauffeur who would drive him around, and who picked up, with Monet sitting in the back seat, the first ever speeding ticket in Giverny, when the speed limit was 1904, and you were not to go faster than a horse at a brisk trot. And presumably they couldn't gauge miles per hour or something at that point. And so that was the speed limit. And evidently Monet exceeded it, or Monet's driver did. And so he had to pay the fine. But one of his sons, the only thing the two of them shared in common, Michel Monet, who lived until 1966. Michel loved fast cars as well. And fittingly, he went probably the way he would have wanted to go, behind the wheel of a sports car when he was, I think, 86 years old, maybe even 88, older. He lived longer than Monet. He crashed on the bridge that very close to Giverny.
Mm.
So yeah, I put Monet and his Panhard Levasseur in, waiting for his driver to turn up and take him somewhere, because one of the things that journalists said when they visited Monet is they would comment on his car collection. So this is dated about 1910, and I've talked to a friend of mine who's written on early automobiles, and so I said, does circa 1910 work with this vehicle? And he said yes. I looked up the registration number, 937.YZ, and but couldn't find online in any case. But
Yeah.
Monet turns up a lot. In one place I got information on his cars was in the sort of touring club and the auto club magazines in France in the first decade of the 20th century, because Monet would go to car races, and he had this collection of cars which was worth, one journalist estimated when he visited him, worth some 32,000 francs. And to put that into context, the wages of the average workman in Paris was 1,000 francs a year. So Monet spent, his car collection was worth the annual wages of 32 guys. But even that paled in comparison to his garden, which cost him 40,000 francs per year. So Monet had money to spend, money
Yeah.
to burn, and he burned it on cars, gardening, food, wine, all of these things that, let's face it, if I had money, that's what I was spending it on as well.
Well, and certainly, I mean, certainly no one struggled financially more than Monet early on. And so when he finally comes into his fairly phenomenal wealth, I mean, I think you're right. I think he does exactly what many of us would do. He spends lavishly. Margarita, let's go to that film. I definitely want everyone to see this short film of Monet.
And it'll take a minute to load.
Yeah, so be patient.
I'll just set it up for you, but it is the summer of 1915. So the war has been raging for almost a year. And the war, besides being fought in the trenches, is being fought on the propaganda front by newspapers, journals, magazines, things like that. And the Germans have launched an offensive against the French, talking about how German culture is superior to French culture. And the French, of course, and they roll out the heavy artillery, which is Beethoven and Immanuel Kant. And they sort of celebrate everything that they've given in art, in literature, in music, and so forth. And the French cannot abide this. And so they begin their own counteroffensive, and begin celebrating the books are written celebrating French artistic excellence, celebrating French music and all of that. And so here we see the great man at his palette in July of 19, or at his easel with his water lily shaped palette, working in the summer of 1915 on a painting which is now in the Portland Museum of Art, Portland, Oregon. And it's bigger than Monet. It's 6.5 feet high. Yeah, so we pan across and see the Japanese bridge. And you can see this is bigger than Monet is. So he would have probably needed help getting it down to the water lily pond. And so he's very, it's a staged painting. The filmmaker, Sacha Guitry, is a great friend of his. He's a kind of theatrical impresario. And he has come to Giverny, where he's been many times before. In fact, Sacha and his partner have a house not too far distant from that. And so he's turned up and chats to Monet, and then he gets out his hand-cranked camera and Monet begins painting. And he is smoking a cigarette, as he always did as he painted. And I've asked curators and restorers if it would be possible to find cigarette ash in his paintings if you looked hard enough, because you can find sand in paintings he did in Trouville, for example. And they've assured me that it probably would turn up there. But yes, so this is what Sacha is doing, is creating a propaganda film to battle the Germans, celebrating, it's called Ceux de chez nous, or those of our land, or those among us, our great countrymen is the theme of it. And so he films Rodin sculpting, Sarah Bernhardt is in it. Edgar Degas did not want to participate, but Sacha, in an early paparazzi style, hid behind a lamppost outside of Degas' apartment and saw him emerge with his niece, and got about 3 seconds before Degas probably clobbered him or something like that. But it's wonderful film footage of Monet at work, because in many ways, maybe we think of him as a figure from the 19th century, and yet here he is in 1915 at work. And what Sacha did with his film was he screened it in Paris in November of 1915. And it's the only film, the only time Monet ever went to the cinema, of course, to see himself. And what Sacha did is he stood in the wings, and when Monet talks, Sacha lip synced. So it was probably the first talking picture ever, because Sacha apparently could do a very good Monet imitation. And so when Monet is chatting with him, Sacha does the Monet impression. And it would be lovely to hear that. Later, Guitry died, I think, just after World War II. And he re-released this film, all of it, not just Monet, but all of the characters, in the 1940s, when once again France was fighting against the Germans and also fighting a propaganda war. And what he did is does give a narration. He doesn't do the impression at that point, but he talks about Monet in his extremely beautiful voice. He has a wonderful speaking voice. He was a great actor and impresario, as I say. And so he's given us this magical glimpse of the great man at work at his easel at the height of his powers in 1915.
Well, even though it's staged, it's just remarkable to see Monet holding that palette and working the brush, looking at a subject, looking back at the canvas, hesitating, starting, stopping. It feels very, very real. I mean, Monet would have only known, one way to paint, whether he's doing it for the camera or doing it for himself, and it's pretty extraordinary thing to see. Now, you've included a photograph of Georges Clemenceau in this PowerPoint. Margarita, can we advance to it next? Now, why is the Prime Minister of France important to the story of Monet?
Well, he's very, very important, and he and Monet go back to the 1860s when they're both young men. Probably with, in the case of Clemenceau, at least, with radical political opinions. Monet, I think, professed them early on, but wasn't really a political animal. Clemenceau, of course, was. And what Clemenceau did ultimately was went on to have a great political career. He went to America in the late 1860s, married an American woman, and then ultimately came back to France, launched his literary career, his journalistic career, and his political career, which kept him very busy for many years. But there was a political scandal in France in the late 1880s, which saw him leave office for some time. And he had time to think. And I think he rediscovered his friendship with Monet. And more to the point, he rediscovered art and Monet's paintings. And he really became Monet's apostle on earth, we could almost say. He became a great celebrant of Monet's abilities. And towards the end of Monet's life, Clemenceau went to India, and he wrote of the light in India. And he said, it's thanks to you that I'm able to appreciate this. You taught me how to see. Anyway, they're very good friends, really inseparable by say, the first decade of the 20th century. They lunched together virtually every week. Clemenceau also had a house in Normandy, so they lived very close together, and would go to each other's houses, talk about art, talk about politics, things such as that. And what fascinated me about the two of them together is their complete opposites. They like the same thing in many ways. They're interested in art and literature because Monet was a great reader, something else that makes him endearing, as was Clemenceau. But Monet was a very curmudgeonly character, I think probably quite shy. I think this carapace that he had, this hardness that this reputation for savagery, as a French newspaper once described him as having, all of these things covered up was what was probably an essential shyness. And he was, I think, wounded by criticism and things like that. And so he had as a kind of protector and opposite Georges Clemenceau, who was an absolutely terrifying figure, who was known as the tiger, le tigre. And everyone called him that except for Monet, who always very respectfully, even after Clemenceau left office, called him Monsieur le Président. He was always Mr. President to Claude, or at least that's how he addressed him when he wrote letters to him. And so we have this wonderful combination of the incredibly articulate, forceful, self-confident, successful Clemenceau, and the somewhat uncertain, anxious, nervous Monet. And Clemenceau is the one ultimately who, when Monet is having his moments of crisis about his reputation, his work, his abilities, especially after the First World War, Clemenceau is the one, more than anyone else. Other friends would always rally around for him, including Sacha Guitry. But the most important one, the one that Monet loved most of all, was Clemenceau. And Clemenceau is the one who encouraged him to do water lily paintings when he was at his darkest moment in 1914, early 1914. Monet's wife had died in 1911, and he stopped painting for a year. And then when he went back to painting in 1912, he discovered he had cataracts and couldn't see properly. And then his son died. His eldest son, Jean, died in early 1914. Monet was at a very low ebb, but at that point, Clemenceau made one of his visits to Monet, and he clearly came with the idea of getting him to paint again. And he looked at some of Monet's water lily paintings done in about 1899 and said, why don't you do more of these? These are rather good. Why don't you paint some more? And that was really all it took for Monet, because by the spring of 1914, he was back at work. He had written a letter of retirement to Paul Durand-Ruel, and this was widely reported in French newspapers that the great Claude Monet, who had this colossal reputation at this point, said that he had stopped painting. But he now started again in the spring of 1914. The tragedy, then, of course, is that the war breaks out immediately after he gets his will and his ability back to paint. But he continues to paint during the war. And in fact, he painted maniacally, almost as he had never painted before during those years. And one of the things I wanted to look at in Mad Enchantment was the water lily paintings as war paintings, because he specifically referred to them as his war work.
Oh my.
For him, an escape from the war, but they also, I think we can see the war reflected in it, especially some of those in the Orangerie in Paris, because he dedicated in 1918, on November the 12th, 1918, so the day after the armistice was signed, he wrote to Clemenceau, who was president of France at that time, wrote to him and said, I'm going to donate 2 of my paintings to the French state to honor the French dead, to honor the French sacrifices as a way of participating in the war effort. And Clemenceau then came to Giverny the following week, the first day off he'd had in a year. He came to Giverny and looked at them and realized there was scope for a much, much larger donation than just 2 paintings.
Yeah.
And that's when this whole thing takes wing, where Clemenceau says, we're going to have, let's do more of these. Let's have a purpose-built Musée Claude Monet. There was going to be the Claude Monet Museum in the heart of Paris. And Monet, of course, was very eager for this to come off. It was his dream to have, his friend Rodin had the Rodin Museum in the center of Paris at the Hotel Biron. And now Monet wanted to have his monument in the heart of Paris. And so that's really what then begins to happen between 1918 and his death in 1926, that he is working on these canvases, touching them, retouching them, having crises of faith in his own abilities because of his eye problems, trying to work these up into something that is going to be a worthy monument to him, and it's going to carry his name forward and be his final statement.
Well, those paintings in the Orangerie are just, it's sort of like living in a Monet dream in a way. Margarita, I'm still looking at the film on the PowerPoint. It's kind of, it seemingly kind of stuck, but it's fine. I think Ross has got us to, if we could just advance it to the cover of Ross's new book. I would like to hear just a little bit.
The most vital image in the entire selection.
Exactly.
Well, and while we wait for that, I shall show you the UK cover of it, which is the American and UK books often have very different titles, and so it's on manuscript illumination or manuscript design. The writing rediscovery of ancient manuscripts in Florence in Italy in the in the right century. I'm going back several hundred years now.
Yeah.
Yes, in the early 1400s. And so the book called The Bookseller of Florence, I think have, fortuitously, I've got this is the, and I'm very happy with this cover because I designed it. I'm the one who said, this is a painting of someone who's very important in the book, a French cardinal named Bessarion, who is a Greek who had come to Italy for the Council of Florence in 1439 to try to bring the Greek and Latin churches back together. And I thought, I knew this painting has his hand on a book. And then a friend of mine, who's a graphic designer with a special interest in typefaces and script, did the writing for me. So yes, it's out this week. After, I guess, Mad Enchantment was, I think, September 2016. So my bank manager, my accountant, my agent are all saying, well, finally, after almost 5 years, something else appears. So yes, and it's about, just to give you a brief précis of it, I need to work on my elevator pitch for it, but it is, the bookseller of Florence is a real person who existed. He was born in 1422, died 1498. So his life really spans the 15th century in Florence. His name was, I'm not expecting any of you will have heard of him, but his name was Vespasiano da Bisticci. And he was the greatest manuscript dealer in Europe, probably the greatest manuscript dealer before Sotheby's and Christie's and things like that in the 20th century. What he did was found, new manuscripts of Cicero, manuscripts of Plato, things like this were coming to light that people had not seen for hundreds of years. And Vespasiano, in his shop in Florence, then turned them into modern manuscripts that could be read with the beautiful, legible, humanistic script. And he had them beautifully decorated. And he produced thousands of manuscripts, which graced the collections of 3 generations of the Medici, from Cosimo, the original Medici, through his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the Pope Nicholas V. Various of the popes got him involved with the founding of the Vatican Library. And the book really gives me an excuse then to talk about, first of all, Florence in the 1400s, which is such an interesting period, and the period that Vespasiano himself said was a golden age, because he wrote about all the people he'd met, all the intellectual luminaries and the heads of state. He met all of them, and he writes about them and describes political events and intellectual occurrences, things like that. And so it just gives me a chance to bring together books and ideas. That rediscovery of Plato, for example, the way Plato came back to the West at that point, the way Roman books on rhetoric came back to the West, people began studying them, and the impact that had on Western thought at that time, and then throwing into the mix the sort of political skullduggery and everything like that, which was, of course, going on at that time as well. And Vespasiano, who at times worked as an ambassador and also a spy, was caught up in all of these intricate maneuverings that were going on. So it was just, that's why it took me almost 5 years, because of the fact it's a kind of panorama of Florence and maybe of Europe more generally during this great golden period. So it's tremendous fun to write, and it's not that thick, but it's probably about as big as The Judgment of Paris. I think it's a similar size in terms of writing, but it could easily have been double this size. Yeah, so they're probably roughly the same.
Yeah.
But yes, I thought just because I'm really interested doesn't mean everyone else is going to be. And so
I bet we will be. I bet we will be. I mean, Ross does a tremendous job of weaving the macro and the micro together into phenomenal stories, and that are rich and beautiful. And thank you for writing another book. And like I said, I will look forward to reading the Bookseller of Florence. Margarita, do we have any questions from the crew?
Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry. I was looking at I was like going through the images. I was seeing them. I didn't know you guys were not seeing them. I apologize.
We got most of them. We got most of them.
But the last
Monet painted for a while. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's see. So we have let's see. I absolutely love Mad Enchantment, and I love how you weave together the stories of Monet and George Clemenceau. What was the spark for you to frame your book this way?
Well, good question. And there was an actual spark, which was, I can't, in my mind, I think I saw this in Giverny, but I think it probably predated a trip to Giverny. But the date is a letter, and they may well have this letter. I need to look back in the house, the line from this letter somewhere in the house. But it's a letter that Monet wrote on September the 1st, 1914, in which he says, "As for me, I will stay here in front of my life's work. And if those barbarians want to kill me, they'll have to do it here in my studio." And I thought, what an amazing moment in Monet's life, because to that point, I really had not thought of Monet in the First World War. And if you look at that date, September the 1st, 1914, more closely, this is before the Battle of the Marne, a week or so later, which saves Paris. And in August 1914, it looked like the Germans were going to take Paris. And in fact, they were probably a day away from taking it. They were certainly bombing it at that point. And also bombing it with leaflets saying, make sure you've got lots of sausages in the restaurants for us when we turn up. All these leaflets were being dropped on Paris, promising what they were going to do. And so I suddenly thought, Monet's water lily paintings, the large ones, all post-date or 1914 or later. And so I thought, what is the relationship between Monet and the First World War? And so fortunately, it becomes a very rich one, because as he's working beside his pond, there is he can hear, when the wind is from the east, he can hear the guns from the Western Front. And once again in March of 1918, it looked as though Paris was going to be invaded by the Germans. And had they reached Paris, they would have swung farther west, and no doubt Giverny would have been occupied again, as it was, of course, in the Second World War. And so I thought it, it brings together history, art, war, all and grand personalities. I was hugely fond of Clemenceau. I just think he's a very admirable character. And, quite apart from what he did with Monet, he was larger than life and never complained. He was he was invincible. And I think that was why he was such a powerful leader in the First World War, as he just would. And Churchill, I deliberately put Churchill together with him because Churchill went to the front with him. Churchill was much younger at that point, obviously, but Churchill's speeches in 1940 echo Clemenceau. He clearly learned his lessons in leadership from Georges Clemenceau. And just the fact that Clemenceau and Monet were such wonderful friends. I got the collection of letters that the two write to each other, where Clemenceau calls him the abominable hedgehog, and talks about him sort of being a crab scuttling under a rock and things like that. It was just so much fun to look at the relationship between the two of them on a personal level, as well as the macro level, and see what happens when you have the two most famous and important people in France working together on creating the Orangerie.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions that came in before, as people were registering. They were able to send some questions, and the Marcaccios sent a couple of questions. I know you may have already answered a few of them through the talk, but I'm going to point out a couple that maybe you have this information, or if maybe Kevin have it. I'm not sure. The question is, how many Americans moved to Giverny?
I'm not sure I have. Kevin, do you have an exact statistic?
No, I wouldn't know that, but I know that, of course, Frederick Friesike is a more or less permanent resident of Giverny.
Who literally lived next door to Monet. A wall divided them. So many of those beautiful, and you've got one in the exhibition, and he's such a showstopper painter. I love his work. He could stand on tiptoe and peer over the garden wall and look into Monet's garden, and vice versa. And so absolutely, he was a very important figure in the local community.
Right. And then Lila Cabot Perry spends a significant amount of time in Giverny, not permanently, but she's there for longer than just a visit. And then Richard E. Miller is another one who's there for a significant period of time.
Right.
And then Guy Rose is there for many years.
Yes, and I was never sure if they were a couple, but Evelyn McCormick, who's certainly a very good friend of his, was there. I think maybe not after 1900, when he lived there, I think, virtually every summer for quite a few years. But of course, what happens? Well, just to go back to, was that Kathleen's question? I'll say hello to Kathleen. The statistic that I remember, that I might misremember, is that 350 painters had worked there. But that's probably not just American. But I would guess that of those 350, if I'm remembering that correctly, probably 90% or 80% were American. It very much was an American colony. But of course, what happens in 1914 is they all leave, understandably. Even the Butlers leave. They go to New York City. And that's why when Monet says in that letter of September the 1st, 1914, "As for me, I'll stay here," that was not an empty boast, because everyone who could was getting out.
Right.
And in fact, the French government had left Paris. It went to Bordeaux. You had to run for safety. And so there was something to be said for this this guy saying, "I'm going to stand, I'm going to fight the Germans with my paintbrush. I'm going to stand here defiantly." And so I think that's why when he's posing for Sacha Guitry and doing that painting, he probably he referred to the Germans always as those barbarians in the course of the First World War. It was a very kind of personal animosity. And it was of great pain to him that the lenses that ultimately helped him to see were German lenses, Zeiss lenses, which helped him to see. I think he would have been much happier had they been a French model.
Well, you know, we have at the Dixon a couple of connections to World War I that are fairly interesting. One is that our founder, Hugo Dixon, was in Germany working in the cotton business. He was English, but he was in Germany working in the cotton business when World War I began. And of course, when the war begins, you don't know, you know, they didn't know it was going to be the war to end all wars.
Right,
and
right.
he was arrested and spent the entirety of World War I in a German internment camp.
Oh, really?
And so we have his journals from that. And had we known you personally, before you started writing Mad Enchantment, we would have sent you a copy of that journal, and maybe Mr. Dixon would have made a footnote or something.
Yes. Yeah. Well, because that sort of thing, that eyewitness description is gold dust. I mean, it's absolutely invaluable for someone who's writing about history,
right?
To get personal letters and journals, things like that.
Of course. And then we also own a number of lithographs. We own a number of works by the artist Jean-Louis Forain, and who even at age 60 re-enlists but his greatest service to France were the drawings that he made for publication in the newspapers of said barbarians.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So, Margarita, why don't we we probably have maybe time for one more question.
Yes, I think so. And still talking a little bit about the Americans in Giverny, one of the questions was also, out of all of them, I don't know, you mentioned 300 plus, who would be the most well-known American Impressionist at Giverny?
Good question. Probably, I would say, I mean, at the one who maybe went on to have the greatest reputation, I suppose, I often think of, maybe because he had such a larger than life personality, and he was certainly influenced by Monet, but I've never been able to find out, Kevin, you might know, if he was set foot in Giverny itself. Was Charles Hassam. Did he ever?
I don't know that he did, honestly, but he's often considered the American heir to Claude Monet.
Yes.
I mean, the comparisons were frequent enough that Hassam early on chafes at it, and later on basically ignores it. But that would be, I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, you know, Hassam was so peripatetic. I mean, he was always on the move.
Yes.
I mean, there's definitely a possibility that he got to Giverny at some point.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me likely that he did. He seems not to have been part of one of those little communities that gathered at that point. But I suppose apart from that, if I think Butler and Robinson are probably the two, and Willard Metcalf also.
Right.
I mean, Metcalf is someone whose career took off, it dipped a bit, and then it came back. And so I think he, as a painter, did fantastic work, as the exhibition shows, when he was in Giverny. And then maybe he had a bit of trouble finding his feet back in America, or he became experimental with, over a few years that didn't quite work out. And I think his sales fell off at that point. But certainly if you think of the big names in American Impressionism, Metcalf is one of them. But all sorts of painters, and Kevin, you mentioned Lilla Cabaperi, and those paintings, I think you have 3 of hers in the exhibition. Beautiful, beautiful paintings. And she is probably as close to a student that Monet ever had. And in fact, she wrote up Monet's advice as to painters, and Monet almost never divulged that. But I think it helped that she came from a very respectable Boston family, and the sort of snob in Monet was willing, very willing to make exceptions for her. But I shouldn't overestimate the hostility Monet had for American painters or Americans in general, because as we've seen, he did have very close relationships with any number of them. And I think Lilith Cabaperi and Guy Rose probably got the biggest benefit from his teaching. You could say maybe that Robinson, Butler, and Metcalf maybe didn't need it quite as much and would have developed just looking at it. But I think Rose was very young when he went. So Monet's instruction was very invaluable to him.
Yeah, I would say that sizes it up pretty accurately. And Ross, I just thank you very much for this presentation today. Thank you for staying up late. I mean, if we were
here at Stillerly, no problem at all.
If our places were reversed, I'd have been doing this in my pajamas. And thank you so much for your contribution to America's Impressionism, because it's a book I'm very proud to have been a part of, and I'm very proud to have shared a piece of that catalog with you. So thank you for that. Thank you for this, and we'll look forward to the next time we see you.
Likewise. Well, thank you for the opportunity, both for that and also for tonight and the other. I mean, I have this special bond with the Dixon, I feel, my third Zoom with them, as well as the exhibition. So I do have to, when travel becomes possible again, I'll have to make it down that way. I know someone in Eastern Tennessee, but the scales in North America are much bigger than here, so I realize that could still be 2 days driving.
but beautiful things to see between
Absolutely.
here and there, or there and here. So, and we hope we'll see you here sometime soon. We wish you good health and stay safe, and thank you again for this wonderful conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you too. Thanks for tuning in.
This was great. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.